So, hello. Today we have on Mr. Walter Rugaber. He's a former journalist. Mr. Rugaber, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good. I think I can speak for both me and Ethan when we say that we're very excited and honored to have you on the podcast today.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, to start off, we like to start off the same way. Where did you grow up?
I was born and raised in Macon, Georgia, the very center of the state. My dad, as you could probably guess from my last name, was a Pennsylvania Dutchman. He and my mother moved south. Actually, he worked for the Coleman Stove Company. Okay. In the pre-camping days, they had invented a floor furnace, which you went into southern homes and cut a hole in the floor, dropped this furnace in there. None of the homes at that time, or very few, had central heating. Yes. And so he brought the floor furnace south, and they sold those things all over the place. And anyway, that's how my Yankee parents got to be Georgians, and I grew up and graduated from high school in Macon.
So which high school did you go to?
It was called Lanier High School at the time. Macon was the birthplace of the poet Sidney Lanier. Okay. And in fact, our football team was known as the Poets. I often look back on that and reflect, not a very fighting term, the Poets, but they were a very good football team. We won a number of state championships.
So were you very academic in high school?
I would say I was average. Yeah. I was interested in certain things and good at certain things, and not interested in other things and not good at those things. So I loved English. I didn't care for French, but I had a lot of interesting experiences in high school. It was a wonderful high school. Rigidly segregated, looking back on it from the vantage point of 2023, it's really quite amazing. I mean, I graduated from high school, you must remember, in 1956, which was more than a little while ago, and at the time it was an all-white high school, and it's amazing to look back on that time and think of the change that's occurred in the years since.
When did it integrate?
It integrated after I went off to college in '56. The Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education had just been handed down in '54, and then the follow-up decision in '55, and so we were still in massive resistance at the time, and it would have been well into the '60s. And in fact, one of the things that happened was the Lanier High School no longer exists. The courts made them do away with all the old names of the high schools. They felt it had a kind of a lingering, I guess it reminded everybody of the old days, and so my high school now has the very indistinguished name of Central High School, and the black school, I'm sure, has an equally indistinguished name. So,
were you very athletic in high school?
Not at all. No. Not all tall people are very graceful, and I'm definitely not very athletic. Clumsy is the word for it.
What about educators? Was there an educator during your high school career that had any serious effect on you personally?
Very much so. Her name was Josephine Early. She was my English teacher first in junior high school, and then about the time I moved to senior high school, she also moved to her teaching position, was transferred to the senior high school, and so I had her a number of years. And she was the first of an amazing series of mentors that I've had during my life. One of the things that interests me as I look at my own children and grandchildren is I don't think young people get as many mentors these days as we used to. I mean, by mentors, I don't mean people who just sort of try to teach you things, but people who did that and who also really seemed to care a lot about you as a person and really want to try to help you as a person. And Miss Early was the journalism advisor in high school. She really took it all very seriously. It was not something she was just going through the motions. She was really serious about the school newspaper, and she really took an interest in those of us who worked on the school paper, and decided early on that I needed to get a good education. And that meant going away to the best journalism school in America at Northwestern in Illinois, which I, of course, had never heard of. And but she kept pushing me and pushing my parents, and I applied and was admitted and got a wonderful education there. She was quite a remarkable lady. She was single. She lived with her elderly mother and another single sister, and had a number of students that she mentored, people who became quite well known at the time. She had quite a career.
So she identified your talent for writing early on?
She seemed to really take an interest in us young people. To a degree that not all teachers did.
Yeah. I'm looking around your house here and I see a lot of books. Was there any specific book from your youth that you think sparked any?
I don't know that I can say that there was. I had an interesting experience. I knew very early on that I wanted to be in the newspaper business. Mm-hmm. And I knew, and I don't know quite how that happened. Nobody else in my family was a newspaper person. No one, in fact, my mother wanted me to be an electrical engineer. She kept pointing out how poorly newspaper reporters are paid or were paid at the time, and this was certainly very true. And I think she also thought being a newspaper reporter was somehow kind of vaguely not exactly respectable, and that if I took an honest occupation like an electrical engineer, that would be better. But I stuck by my guns. This is what I wanted to do from the earliest age, and in some ways it benefited me. I've thought as I see my kids and my grandkids come along. Some of my kids, all of whom are in their 50s now, still don't know what they want to do when they grow up. And I think in some ways it was a tremendous advantage as a young person to have that certainty. This is what I know I want to do. It just saved me an awful lot of indecision and hand-wringing and wondering about, what my future might be and all that sort of thing. On the other hand, looking at some of the experiences of my own kids, I probably missed a lot of things too. I mean, I was so focused on newspapering and journalism that I probably let a lot of other things go by that might have interested me a lot. So, what's best? I don't know. But anyway, to answer your question, no, I don't think there was particularly a book. At the time, there were anthologies of newspaper reporting that I devoured, and this was in the mostly pre-television days, and there was a radio program which featured journalistic exploits, famous stories that journalists had done, and of course I listened to every one of those programs religiously, but I don't remember a particular book, no.
What was the what was the application process like for applying to Northwestern?
That's very amusing and great question, but I'm smiling because it was so totally different than it is now.
Yeah.
I wrote a letter to the admissions director asking for an application.
Mm-hmm.
He mailed it to me. I filled it out. I mailed it in. I must have taken the SATs, but it was early days for the SATs then. I must have done that, but at any rate, a period of time went by. I got a letter from them saying you're admitted. Fall of 1956 arrived. My mother and dad put me in the back of their Buick, and we drove off to Evanston, which is just north of Chicago. We found my dorm. They put me out in the parking lot, waved goodbye. This was the first I'd ever laid eyes on Northwestern University. And of course, nowadays, young people have the advantage of touring colleges and being interviewed at the schools themselves. Much better than when I was doing it. It really was amazingly dark ages as far as college admissions are concerned. It's quite astonishing to look back and think how different it was then from how it is now.
Do you think that you would have liked having the experience that we have nowadays?
Again, it's sort of like having your career firmly in mind. I don't know what is best. In a way, you know, I arrived at Northwestern with a fairly healthy attitude. I wasn't full of crazy ideas about what college was really going to amount to. It was just another step. I think it was a more matter-of-fact thing, but on the other hand, I might have been better if I'd have applied to more schools, been able to tour around and look at different schools. I might have seen a place I liked better. Who knows? That's the only Northwestern's the only school I applied to. As I say, I got a wonderful education there, but I think nowadays when you get an opportunity to look at different schools and think about what you really want to do in life and what the best fit is for you, I think that's better.
Yeah. What was the major selection process like? Did you choose one when you applied, or did you choose after the first year?
At the time, and I'm not at all sure this is how Northwestern does it. The reason I went to Northwestern, they had at that time the best known journalism school in the country. So I was admitted to the journalism school, and in that sense, my major was sort of pre-selected, if you will. But they had a very good idea, which was that people who were going to be journalists, really in many ways the last thing they needed to know was about journalism, because they figured you were going to learn that when you went out and got a job, which is certainly true. And what you did need to know, though, was all sorts of things in the area of liberal arts: history, politics, economics, political science, and so on. And so they required you to select a liberal arts major and minor, and to take as many courses in those subjects as you would had you been in the liberal arts college. Looking back on it from the advantage of hindsight, I realized what a wonderful thing that was. I took relatively a limited number of courses in pure journalism, and the advantage was I got this wonderful broad education, and that's what I really needed.
Were you satisfied with your education at the end of your 4 years at Northwestern University?
Very much so. I mean, it was a rigorous school. I started off. You were asking about major. I was going to be an economics major, because I really did think it was so important that people who read the newspaper understand what was happening with economic issues.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how much math was was involved in economics, and I remember getting about as far as money and banking, and I think professor called me into his office and said, "Rugaber, I'm going to let you out of here with a C if you promise never to darken the door of the economics department again." And I said, "It's a deal." And so I moved on and finally wound up in history, which was safely beyond all the math.
Yeah.
So at the end of your time at Northwestern University, and you're about to graduate, did you have any jobs lined up? Were you interviewing for positions at newspapers?
Yes, I had developed a really keen interest in Washington, and in the national government and how it operated, Congress, the president, and so on and so forth. All very glamorous at the time. And while I was in school, I had wangled my way into various things in Washington. So I had figured out how to do sort of little mini field trips and that sort of thing. I'd gotten to meet a number of people in journalism, and so I really wanted a job in Washington, and I interviewed and was hired as a reporter on the Washington Star, a newspaper which is no longer with us. Graduated from Northwestern, moved to Washington, and the newspaper decided after I got there, I'd had a couple of minor medical issues in college, and they decided these medical issues disqualified me under their health insurance plan, and so they wouldn't hire me. So I had to scramble around, and one of the friends I made, another mentor, a man named Sterling Green, who was a famous reporter for the Associated Press in Washington at the time, had a friend on Capitol Hill who worked for a Texas congressman, and they hired me for a while just to do donkey work for this congressman. I mean, by donkey work, I mean clipping stories about him out of all the weekly papers in his district, and writing his weekly newsletter and all that sort of thing. But it kept the wool from my door while I waited to see what might happen, and I finally concluded. Let's see, this was probably 6 or 8 months after graduation. I finally concluded that they weren't ever going to hire me, and so I pulled up stakes in Washington, went back to my hometown of Macon, where I had worked during high school as a reporter for the local radio and television station, and they rehired me, and so that was my real first journalism job out of college.
You mentioned that radio station hired you. Did you ever consider media outside of the written realm in terms of radio or movies, I guess?
No, I never really did. I really never thought of myself as being very articulate, and then as well as now, the people on television and radio were very articulate, and they could talk much better than I could. And at the time, people like myself were not very often, if ever, on the air. We wrote the copy for people to read or whatever they were doing, but we ourselves didn't ever actually have to appear on camera or in front of a microphone. I mean, unless it was some disaster that had occurred or something that required us to really be there and broadcast in person. And so I never really looked at it as as an electronic job. I never thought I would be much good at that. I enjoyed it because it was a serious news organization.
Yeah.
It was really, in a way, at that time, for no particular reason, I regarded it as a more serious news organization than the local newspaper. So I was happy to be working for the radio and television station, but I never really saw myself as a broadcaster. That was never in the cards.
So which areas did you cover while you were at the radio station?
Well, in those days and in a small town like that, Macon at the time probably had a population of maybe 100,000, and so you basically covered everything. Now we're in late 1960. John Kennedy has just been elected president. The civil rights movement is just about to explode. I believe the first lunch counter sit-ins were in Greensboro in I want to say February of 61. I could be off on that it might have been 60. But anyway, clearly the civil rights issues were beginning to get going, and that was certainly true in Macon. And so I followed that. Had some interesting stories, came to the attention of the editor at the Atlanta Journal, and in I guess the middle of '61, he offered me a job as a reporter on the Atlanta Journal, and I, of course, grabbed it and went off to Atlanta.
What was that move like from Macomb to Atlanta?
Again, sort of like my college experience, it really is amusing to me to look back on it. I didn't have a car, and I can't remember how. I suppose a friend or someone must have driven me to Atlanta, and for the first week or two, I stayed in the local YMCA, which still rented you a bed, until I could find a little apartment out on Peachtree Road, which I think I paid $90 a month for. Maybe not quite that much, actually. I mean, my pay was $90 a week, so I couldn't just throw money around left and right. But my job, my initial job on the Atlanta, the Atlanta Journal was the afternoon paper in Atlanta, but at the time it was actually the larger of the two papers. It had a bigger circulation than the morning paper, which was the Constitution. And it had a big circulation out in the state. So I was hired as a reporter to basically roam the state and write mostly, I guess, feature stories about things going on, but oftentimes you would come across actually important news that was going on, and it was an interesting experience. Georgia is it has the most counties of any state in the country except for Texas. Georgia has 159 counties, and Texas has somewhat more than that. But anyway, each of these counties had a local political battle going on. So there were a lot of interesting stories to write about.
At this point, did they give you a car, or did you purchase your own car as you were traveling around the state?
They gave me a car, not a very handsome car, but it got me around all right. No, I didn't get my first automobile until and almost I guess it was just before I got married. I met my wife on the Atlanta Journal. She was also a reporter. She had a car, which was one of her many attractions. It was a small Hillman Minx. I don't think they even make them anymore. I'm sure they don't. But she would give me rides home in the evening after work, and that's how we got to be a couple.
So how long did you spend at the Atlanta Journal?
I was at the Journal from 1961 until essentially the end of '64. We were a young and feisty lot, and when I say we, I mean the reporting staff, my wife and a good many others. And we thought, correctly I think, even still, that the Atlanta newspapers were not doing a very good job of covering the civil rights movement, which was clearly going to be the big story of our generation. And the Atlanta papers had a chance to be the really definitive, authoritative source of information about the civil rights movement, and they really did not cover it very actively. They covered it. They had to cover it. But I remember vividly when the Atlanta schools were integrated in 1961. It was a huge international story. Reporters from all over the world really were there. It was a very important experience because, of course, there had been violence and trouble at integration in other places, most notably Little Rock. But Atlanta integrated its schools peacefully, and that was considered a big deal at the time. And our papers put the story at the bottom of the front page, which enraged us feisty young bucks who thought we knew it all. But at any rate, and this was probably pretty typical, and a lot of us wanted to leave and did eventually leave, but in the meantime had a chance to be on the front row of some, astonishing things. The Birmingham church bombing I covered. I was thinking the other day, I covered a story involving a young black boy. He was 15 at the time. He was accused of shooting and killing a elderly white farmer in a very rural area of Georgia. This would not have occasioned much interest, except that the jury, after a 45-minute trial, sentenced him to the electric chair. He would have been the youngest person ever executed in the United States. 15 is a bit young, even for the Georgia of 1960. This would have been 62, 63, I guess. So that's caused a huge hullabaloo. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to the governor of Georgia and said he should do something about this, and the Pope got involved, and it was really a very interesting story, and I was able to dig up a lot of information that really raised some serious questions as to whether this young man had actually killed the old farmer or not. He eventually got another trial and then another trial, and was long gone from Georgia by this time. So, but anyway, lots of stories like that. It was an extremely interesting time to be a newspaper person.
Did you ever meet any of the leaders of the civil rights movement?
Many times. One of our fondest memories. One of the in those days, Atlanta was the host of a large state fair. And of course it had midway rides, roller coasters, all that sort of thing. And my wife Sally and I were there one year and bumped into Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy, who were there with their kids riding the roller coaster, and we had some conversation, and it was really extremely. One of my fondest memories of Martin Luther King is remembering seeing him, and it wasn't all of his children, I don't think, but I remember what a classic moment it was to see him and his whatever children he had with him, jumping in the cars of the roller coaster and going off, and you know it was just such a classic fatherly thing to be doing. And he had, I'm trying to think, he had not won the Nobel Peace Prize by this point, I don't think, and the idea, but he was certainly extremely world famous at the time, and to just see him doing something so ordinary as hopping in a roller coaster with his children is quite a memory.
That must have been surreal because he's such a monumental figure
Yeah.
in American history.
Yeah, really.
We often talk about on the podcast about how we'll idolize people. We'll see these popular, famous, influential individuals.
Almost made of granite.
We perceive them as made of granite, but when you meet them face to face, they're just a human like all of us. It's interesting to see, and I think that's a great example of that.
Well, I think one of the things that's I've thought about a lot myself lately is our difficulty, and I hope I can articulate this without getting myself in trouble, but our difficulty in dealing with the fact that famous people are never perfect. And, you know, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they owned slaves. You know, we find issues with practically all famous people, and indeed Martin Luther King, who was, in my opinion, a great man, truly amazing. But you know, he had his flaws, and I think we need to do a better job of dealing with that sort of thing.
Right.
But there were a lot of other people. I mean, the civil rights movement was really quite, as you look back on it, totally different from how it is today. Totally different. In fact, I would recommend to you young people, there's a video documentary called Eyes on the Prize, which was originally broadcast probably in the 80s. I want to say it's got a lot of documentary footage on the civil rights movement. It's quite amazing to watch that series. I think it's available on Amazon or Netflix. I'm not sure which, but it's really quite amazing to look at that series of documentary programs on the civil rights movement. Now, it has a completely different feel to it than race relations in our country do, I think, today. Just a completely different thing. And at any rate, in the 60s, of course there was Martin Luther King, but there were so many other really interesting and dynamic and quite charismatic people. Head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a guy named Jim Foreman, who not many people would know that name now, but he was a very powerful speaker, a great organizer. And of course, it was the young people that really drove so many of the civil rights accomplishments.
Did the Freedom Riders go through Georgia too?
Mostly Alabama.
Alabama.
I can't even remember whether they...
Because I think the Student Nonviolent Organization, that was them, wasn't it?
Yes, that was there in something called CORE, C-O-R-E, which stood for the Congress on Racial Equality. Okay. I think was instrumental in organizing the Freedom Rides. And they got in trouble. The violence occurred in Alabama.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So,
you mentioned digging up information for various different articles that you wrote about the civil rights movement. How did you find that information? Because you didn't have the internet. Nowadays, Luke, I know it's a very generational.
It is amazing.
But when I'm trying to prepare to publish an episode for the podcast, I use the internet as my go-to resource.
Sure.
It's kind of hard to understand what my go-to resource would be if I didn't have the internet.
It's really incomprehensible to younger generations today.
It's always been there for us.
It's almost incomprehensible to me, as a matter of fact. It is terribly interesting. You depended on getting information from the people involved. Obviously the civil rights movement, the civil rights people had a vested interest in getting the maximum amount of newspaper coverage they could get. I mean, one of the accusations, of course, of the white supremacists was that we were being used by the civil rights movement to stir up trouble and that sort of thing, which is probably pretty much true. That was their objective, and nobody made any particular bones about it. But it was also true that we were frequently fed information by whites on the other side of the issue, and there was no internet. There were no cell phones. You did depend on newspaper clippings from past stories, which you carried with you when you could, but you really relied on your memory. And of course, the nature of news was I think a good bit different then than it is now, in that the news was much more, I think, event-driven.
Yeah.
In other words, and at that time, we were covering the civil rights movement. There were marches, there were sit-ins, there were demonstrations in front of courthouses. Maybe one of the big battlegrounds in the early civil rights movement was in Albany, Georgia, and the school children, some of them quite young, would turn out and demonstrate, and the police would arrest them and throw them in jail. And I guess my point is, you were really dependent on what you saw with your very own eyes, and you didn't really need to go to the internet and get a lot of sort of background. It was all right there in front of you.
How active was the Klan in Georgia at this time?
Oh, very active.
Did you ever have any encounter with them?
Quite often. They were there were different Klan organizations around the South. The ones in Alabama, I think, were particularly violent. The ones in around Atlanta, when the Atlanta schools were integrated, it's very interesting to look back from this vantage point. When the Atlanta schools were integrated in 1961, the Klan had bombed the Jewish temple in Atlanta, and the Klan had done a number of other violent things. And the leadership in Atlanta, the mayor and the chief of police, obviously decided if they were going to be successful in having a peaceful desegregation of the schools, they had to deal with the Klan. Yeah. And the police and the FBI, I think, identified the leading Klan's people and followed them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all before and during the school integration, and that really sort of put a damper on the ability of the Klan to really do very much, and they didn't do very much.
You see the FBI during this time in the 60s, they were following them, yes, but they were also following leaders of the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
How active and entrenched were the federal government in these movements around Atlanta at this time?
Still, I think, a touchy and controversial subject. All the civil rights people, led by Martin Luther King, were very dissatisfied, and there was a lot of evidence that the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, did not want the FBI to play an aggressive role in the civil rights movement. And in fairness, these were still seen more as local state issues as opposed to federal issues. And the FBI always deferred to the local law enforcement, which in a lot of communities and areas in the South at that time was dominated by groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. And so from the civil rights folks' point of view, the FBI was never doing enough. From the local leadership, the local police chiefs, sheriffs, that sort of thing, they, of course, regarded this as their jurisdiction.
Yeah.
These people were in their cities, their counties, and they didn't need or want the FBI messing around in their business.
Right.
And so there was that constant clash of points of view, and it'll never be settled. But sometimes, I think as the history moved along, I covered the trial of the 18 Klansmen who were involved in the murder of the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi during Freedom Summer, and by that time the Klan was clearly deeply. I mean, they broke the case. The Klan actually, the FBI actually broke the case and got a person to confess, and that enabled the federal government to prosecute these 18 people, of whom can't remember exactly, but I think 8 or 10 of them were actually tried and convicted in federal court.
Yeah. And during that time also, you see Attorney General Kennedy. Did he go after much hate crime in Georgia with his Justice Department?
Again, I think as time went on, they got more involved. Attorney General Kennedy had a deputy for civil rights named John Doar, D-O-A-R, who was quite a remarkable person. For one thing, he was a Republican, which is quite amusing to look back on. But John Doar was quite an amazingly strong figure. and he led a lot of the, not just the prosecutions of those cases, but a lot of the activity in the civil rights movement as the years went by. So they got more involved as the years passed.
You said earlier about making contacts with people. How do you find sources when you're in the field?
Well, and I think almost all, if not all, of the civil rights cases, there would be a local group, a local movement, always led by one of the young people from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or one of Martin Luther King's people would be there, and there'd be it would be Selma, or it would be Montgomery, or it would be Savannah, or Little Rock, or wherever it might be. And there would be someone there that you would get in contact with, and you'd always go by and talk to the sheriff or the police chief, and they were amazingly forthcoming themselves with information about, what was going on. The business community was always a good source because they had an interest in peace and quiet. And so they were often in negotiations with the civil rights folks over, sit-ins, jobs, school issues, whatever. The local business leadership was often a good source. A lot of different people were involved, and you just drove around and talked to them one by one.
So you made connections with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you feel like that's harder nowadays than it was then, to make connections with people and to?
I really don't know. Not having done it in quite a few years, I'm not sure. No, I don't know. I think it's probably pretty much. My guess is it's pretty much like it always was. I think that nowadays there's a lot of news that's based on not so based on events as it was then.
Yeah.
And to that extent, the sourcing is a little different. But I don't know that. I think you still have to do the same things you did then.
So what was the catalyst that finally led to you and your wife moving on from Atlanta?
As I say, dissatisfaction with the what we saw as the Atlanta newspapers' lack of aggressive coverage of the civil rights movement. Plus, I had a person who was another mentor and a close friend, and who happened to be city editor of all places, the Detroit Free Press, and he hired me to go to Detroit.
Okay.
And it was really, and so we did that. I guess at the beginning of 1965, I spent 65 and 66 in Detroit, and it was really quite amazing. The young couple from Atlanta, never been out of the South very much, went to Detroit, which at the time was automobile central. I think General Motors at that time sold 48% of all the cars made in America. Japanese, Germans, just a little tiny fraction of the market. And Detroit at the time was an industrial powerhouse, fascinating to us on so many levels. It really was a very interesting couple of years. And again, I got lucky. Ralph Nader came along just as I got to Detroit. And Ralph Nader published, I spent about 6 or 8 months on the Detroit Free Press, covering a lot of just sort of interesting stories. But another guy I knew from the South had become the national editor of the New York Times. He called me. They had an opening in Detroit, the Times did. And so in the summer of '65, I left the Free Press and went to work at the New York Times as its Detroit correspondent. And the day I went to work was the day Ralph Nader published Unsafe at Any Speed, which was his book exposing what he regarded, and which was the lack of safety improvements in American automobiles. It was a very interesting concept. Nobody had really, this was unheard of at the time, but Nader's point was people are going to have automobile accidents. They're being human, and it's really Detroit's job to design the cars so that when you do have an accident, you're not as prone to injury. And believe it or not, that was a hard concept to grasp at the time.
Did they have a big impact in the city?
Oh, huge,
Yeah.
huge. The industry was quite concerned about what turned out to be ultimately the regulation of auto safety, which there had been none, and it became quite an issue, and eventually Congress passed the National Highway Safety Act, which established an agency to sort of set safety standards for cars in America. And, it's hard, again, it's kind of hard to look back and imagine it was not easy to get a seatbelt even on a car at that time, much less the harnesses and...
Something that's so common today.
Yeah.
That's why I
a
don't
car
know.
without one.
Today we see organizations like the UAW, United Auto Workers. What was the unionization of auto workers in Detroit like at that time? Was it very present?
Very present. I would say the Walter Reuther, the famous automobile union leader, was still very much, let's see, I guess by this point he was retired, but his image was still very much around, and the union was very powerful. And the big three automaker, as I say, the Japanese and Germans were not much of a factor. But yeah, the union was a major player in Detroit at the time.
Was Henry Ford II the CEO
Yeah.
of?
He was.
How did he deal with unions too? Because I heard he was pretty cutthroat when it came to.
I'm sure he was. I remember Henry Ford and I did cover Henry Ford, and he was extremely amusing. He had a very cavalier attitude. I just, in a way, it was so refreshing. I mean, I guess he's not the first person who said this, but he was in some difficulty with he had a lot of marital issues, and he was in some difficulty with his current wife, and stories were being written which weren't very flattering. And I remember at a press conference once he got asked some question about this, and he looked at the person that asked the question and said, "It's my policy, never complain and never explain." Which, as I say, he was not the only person who's ever said that. But he had a rather he had a cavalier attitude, which I'm sure many people found to be off-putting, but I thought it was kind of refreshing myself.
Yeah. Because I heard he shut down the Ford facilities for over a day one time.
Oh, I'm
Over the
sure.
threat of unionization.
Well, union was certainly very well established at Ford.
That might not be the specific reason why he did it, but I remember there was a story where he shut down the factory and sent everybody home.
Of course, his grandfather, Henry Ford I, was notoriously anti-union and had many battles with the union. Yeah.
Was it nerve-wracking to work for a much larger newspaper than a much smaller newspaper? Was there more pressure there involved?
No, I wouldn't say necessarily nerve-wracking. It was very different.
Yeah.
The newspaper was hundreds of miles away in New York, and I was out in Detroit. And so I dealt with them over the telephone all the time. That part was very different. And the sort of stories they were interested in, since it wasn't a local paper, that was very different. And you had to get used to all these crazy New Yorkers who, who I remember once writing about an automobile safety issue that involved brakes. And New York kept calling me saying, we need more information in this story about how brakes work. And I thought this was ridiculous. Everybody knows how brakes work. You put your foot on the pedal and it stops the car. And I basically wrote that, and they called up and said, this is exactly what we need. Give us more of this. And so I had to describe how when you put your foot on the pedal, it causes a hydraulic thing to depress the calipers against the disc or whatever. In those days, I guess it was shoes on the drum. Anyway, they kept calling and saying, this is perfect. This is exactly what we want. And I realized nobody in New York actually drove a car. They always took the subway everywhere they went, and so they didn't know anything about automobiles. So that part was very different.
Was your wife still in journalism in Detroit?
She followed, and the Free Press couldn't hire her because we were married. She worked for a time at a suburban newspaper and enjoyed that very much. Then in the next year, our first child arrived, and she stayed at home to look after our baby.
What was that like, becoming a father?
Wonderful in a way. Looking back on it, it was really quite changed our lives, of course, immensely for the better. Made us think outside ourselves. It was a wonderful thing that happened.
Did becoming a father change how you looked at certain issues within society?
No, not really. Probably should have, but I really can't claim that it did.
How did it affect your work? Were you more distracted, or were you still hyper-focused on the job?
I'm not necessarily proud to say that I was still awfully focused on the job. That's just, I mean, we moved a lot. I spent, when my daughter was, I guess, 2, we moved to back to Atlanta. There we had our older son. And then we moved to Washington in '69, and then we had our second son. And we did an awful lot of things together. I guess all parents look back on the early days of parenthood and think they should have or could have or wish they would have done more with their children. But I have a lot of memories of things. We hiked many a mile together and camped out, and so I think I probably did more than I remember.
Yeah.
Did you want to instill your love of journalism and writing into them?
No.
No.
It turns out that our older son Christopher is a economics writer for the Associated Press in Washington, but he came by that through a sort of a circuitous way, and really I didn't encourage any of them to. I think that's not appropriate.
Yeah. Kids
ought to do what they want to do.
Yeah. During this time, were you still working with the New York Times?
Mm-hmm.
Through all these
years? Mm-hmm. They moved me to these different places.
When you moved back to Atlanta, you were still working for the Times.
Mhm.
How was covering Atlanta for the Times different than covering Atlanta for the Atlanta Journal?
The civil rights movement was changing pretty drastically. We're now in, let's see, when I went back to Atlanta, it would have been 67 and 68. And the things were changing. Martin Luther King, of course, was assassinated in 68. In the spring of that year. But I guess the main difference I noticed when I went back was that the more violent white resistance seemed to have pretty much, the overt white resistance seemed to have pretty much faded.
So how long were you in Atlanta before you moved to Washington?
2 years.
2 years.
Went to Washington. I used to say, well, Richard Nixon and I arrived on the same day, 1969. And so I finally got to Washington, D.C., where I wanted to go when I graduated from Northwestern. Finally made it. And of course, again, it was at a very interesting time.
Yeah. Were you covering Washington, the political beat in Washington at this time, or were you?
Well, a different thing. I went originally to cover the Nixon White House,
Okay.
and I did not care for that assignment at all, mainly because, and we realized later on a lot more clearly than we did when we were in the middle of it all. But Nixon, of course, went in to office determined to really kind of control the press, and he had his assistants really insulate him, and I'd never done anything like this. I mean, I'd always had access to the people I was covering. I had no access to Richard Nixon at all, and really everything that a reporter did in the Nixon White House was very carefully managed.
Yeah.
I hated it.
Did you ever meet Richard Nixon?
Never met him. Never met him. I mean, shouted questions at him from a distance. But he was a very, as I say, he went into office determined that he was going to manage his press coverage and he was going to keep people at an arm's length, and he did.
Was Ford more accessible to the public than Nixon?
I guess by this time I had gotten out of the White House and never wanted to go back. So by the time Ford came in, I was doing other things.
Richard Nixon has a very interesting presidency. And
Very.
Looking into you, we've learned about your personal experience with the Watergate scandal. Can you go into and explain to the listener a little bit about the Watergate scandal and your place in it?
Yeah, I'd say one thing about what you just said about Nixon. There was a very famous New York Times columnist, now deceased, named Bill Safire, Safire. Bill was a Republican. He worked for Richard Nixon, but he understood. I mean, he kept his distance from Nixon. I mean, he worked for him, but he wasn't a sycophant.
Yeah.
And he said a very penetrating thing about Richard Nixon. He said Richard Nixon is like a 7-layer cake. You cut it down. There's the good Nixon, the bad Nixon, the good Nixon, the bad Nixon, the good Nixon, and the bad Nixon. And those early years when I was in the White House, I remember, Nixon established the EPA. Nixon did some very progressive things about, I think, birth control and world population problems. There was he was a very complex character, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
And in some ways, it's sort of a shame that he's remembered almost entirely for Watergate, because he did do all these other things. But I was covering politics in 1972, and I'd been assigned to the Hubert Humphrey campaign. Humphrey was running for the Democratic presidential nomination, and I was frankly bored. Humphrey was a wonderful gentleman, but I didn't find his campaign very exciting. He'd been down in Florida, came back to Washington on the weekend of June 17th for a little R&R, and I got up on Sunday morning and saw the stories about the Watergate break-in. I had a sense that this was going to really become a huge issue and problem for Nixon. A lot of the early coverage thought that the CIA might be involved, that because the four of the arrested people were Cuban immigrants who'd been involved with the CIA and had been involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion, that somehow it was a plot among Cuban Americans to do something or other. None of this, I thought, made any sense at all. And my main idea was that I could get out of covering Hubert Humphrey. So I talked my way onto the Watergate story, which wasn't really very hard to do at the time because nobody else was very interested in it at all. These two crazy young reporters on the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were interested, and I was interested, and a few others were interested. But the big shots, the important people, were interested in more engaging things, and they were perfectly content to let us piddle away with Watergate until later on, of course.
Did you work directly with Bob Woodward and Bernstein?
I worked directly against them.
Against
It was a very interesting time, and we became, I haven't seen either one of them now in quite some long time. We had interesting different approaches to the story. My idea was that I had a hunch Nixon was probably involved, and certainly very senior people in the White House were involved. And my sense of it was that this was a story that could cause a young reporter very serious trouble, not to mention his newspaper. And so my idea was to see what I could do as far as unraveling this thing by getting the documentary information that might be available. And Carl and Bob approached it from a different direction. Their idea was to interview as many people as they could who'd been involved in the Nixon apparatus. My anxiety about that was when you find to interview people and they tell you things, but after you write them, will they still stand behind what they've told you? Whereas the documentary evidence is nice and solid. In some ways, their approach was the more successful, but I think if I were doing it all over again, I'd still stick with mine, because I did get an awful lot of good stories that way, and they were stories that proved to be impossible for the Nixon White House to deny. So.
Yeah. Do you have a specific breakthrough story regarding Watergate that you wrote?
I think that one of the things that really, and Woodward and Bernstein mentioned this briefly in their book, it occurred to me that there must be an awful lot of documentary information down in Miami, which is where these 4 Cuban Americans had come from, who had done the burglary at the Watergate. And Miami had a prosecutor who was a Democrat. And the prosecutor, we had a mutual contact, so I thought, why not try to enlist him in helping me find out what actually happened? So I flew down to Miami and persuaded him to subpoena the 2 things: the telephone records of the main Cuban American, a guy named Bernard Barker, and his bank account, all the checks that had passed through his bank account. So he did this, and I don't know whether he was one step ahead of the FBI or one step behind them, but anyway, he got all this information, which of course he immediately gave to me. And you were asking earlier about the lack of access to the internet. It was very interesting. I had all these telephone records, and in those days, a long-distance call was still a big deal, and the phone company every month gave you a list of all the calls you'd made. So every long-distance call that Barker had made was listed on his phone bills, but only the phone number. And in those days, no internet. The only way to look these numbers up was to go down to the Library of Congress, which had what were called city directories. They were basically glorified phone books with reverse telephone numbers, page after page after page of them. And you would go, and so the phone bill would say a certain number in suburban Maryland, and you would go and look it up and it would be a veterinarian or a beauty shop or whatever it would be. Not very significant. And then you would see other numbers that were too new to be in the directory, so you'd have to call them up. And if you were lucky, they'd answer the phone, Joe's Meat Market or whatever it was. But unfortunately, sometimes they just said hello, and then you had to wangle around and try to get them to reveal who they were. But the great breakthrough came when I called one of these numbers, and the cheery voice on the other end of the line said, "Committee to re-elect the president, Gordon Liddy's office." And so that was one of the early stories. They'd made all these phone calls to Gordon Liddy before the break-in. The other thing that was partly successful and partly unsuccessful was the bank accounts. And that contained the famous checks that had come through the Texas oil business, and that also linked the burglary to the Nixon campaign. I mean, in other words, the Cubans had been given these checks that they had deposited to finance their travel to Washington and so forth. And these were checks that had come that were Nixon campaign checks. So those were a couple of stories that again were good, solid stories that were hard to refute. I mean, you had the paper right in your hand.
And that was also before donors had to be disclosed, wasn't it?
It was in the process of happening, but
Right.
it was
just before.
Just before. Mm-hmm.
And Liddy, he went to jail, didn't he not?
He did. He did.
Okay.
He was a very unusual character. He became famous for his unusual qualities.
So once the story really broke down and Nixon ended up resigning, how did that rock Washington especially in the field of journalism?
Oh, sure. Never, totally unprecedented. Now, of course, we wouldn't, we probably wouldn't think anything about it. But it was a huge deal. And the politics were quite considerably different then. You know, what finally happened was it became, and by this time I'm long out of the story. I'm not doing anything. But late in the investigations, it turned out that Nixon had tape recorded many or most all of his office conversations, and there was a big battle over whether the Senate and then the special prosecutor could get copies of these tapes. Nixon, of course, resisted. Supreme Court ordered him to turn them over. He did turn them over, and the minute he did that, a conversation he had in his office made it very clear that he had tried to get the CIA and the FBI to shut down the Watergate investigation. That was a so-called smoking gun, and he resigned a few days later. So,
Because he tried to pressure the CIA to get the FBI to drop the case.
he did.
Yeah. So the president resigns. How does that scandal, the Watergate scandal, impact investigative journalism from that point on? Did it change?
Oh, hugely.
Yeah.
Hugely. And I think we're probably still working out all the ways that it impacted investigative journalism. Some extremely healthy. One of the healthy things that it did was it interested a lot of young people in journalism and in investigative journalism. It showed them what an important and useful and valuable civic tool that is. So we had a lot of new blood coming into the newspaper and journalism in general. And then some not so positive ways. I mean, it immediately became common for every little scandal to be a Watergate.
Yeah.
So it was this gate and that gate and some other gate. And I remember I was getting a little tired of Washington at the time, actually. I was beginning to think of leaving. And I remember thinking, you know, this is going to get us in trouble because every little thing is not necessarily Watergate.
Yeah.
And indeed, I think some things did happen where investigative stories were overblown, and that was regrettable.
I read in an article that the Nixon presidency forever changed how the White House interacted with the press. Do you feel that is true?
I would say in many ways that's certainly true. It's very difficult now for anybody in politics, most particularly a president, whose every breath is covered not only by newspapers but by bloggers and, you know, people on Twitter or whatever it's called, and you know, their every move is watched, and it becomes impossible for people in politics to really be as frank, I think, as they used to be. And I think they're much more gun-shy and cautious. They know that if they admit any error, that they'll be crucified. And so they don't. And they hold the press as far away from them as they can, and I can't say as I would blame them.
Do you think the progression of modern media, specifically social media, has instilled a sense of honesty among politicians?
I don't know I really don't know the answer to that.
I guess I shouldn't use the word honesty in politician, but
Well, politicians get a bad rap. I mean, I think in some ways the explosion of media, social media in particular, it has indeed allowed ordinary people to have access to the media. And I see a lot of positive things. I mean, you two guys, you're doing this podcast. You've done 34 of them. What an amazing thing that is. That's absolutely astonishing. It's wonderful. But I think there are also a lot of very negative aspects to it. I think it's making it very difficult in politics to compromise, and without compromise in politics, you're in, as I think George Bush once said, deep doo-doo.
You mentioned that after Watergate happened and everything started becoming its own gate, you wanted to leave Washington. When did you leave Washington?
Oh, I left at the end of 1978. I really I think one of the distinguishing characteristics of journalists, we have short attention spans, or at least in the olden days we tended to have short attention spans. And the wonderful thing about being a reporter and editor was that every day is different. There's always a new story, a new thing to get interested in. Something new is happening. The downside of that, and this is what happened in Washington, is sometimes it's not new. It's getting kind of boring. And I remember I guess I was in charge of economic coverage in Washington at the Times. And I came home one evening, I remember, and saying, if I have to listen to these people debate the deregulation of natural gas one more time, I think I'm going to go stark raving nuts because this was an issue at the time that had been floating around Washington for a long time. And I began to reflect on the fact that it seemed like the same issues just kept coming up, and I'd sort of ground through them all and was ready to do something else. Yeah. So I walked in the house and the phone was ringing, and it was the head of a little media business based in Norfolk called Landmark Communications, and they were looking, he said, for an editor of their paper in Greensboro. And I sort of knew North Carolina journalism, respected it immensely, and we talked, and I was very impressed. They offered me the job, and I took it. And it totally changed my life for the better, for the most part.
Yeah. In what ways would you say?
I had an opportunity. I got burned out sort of on Watergate, and I became an editor of the New York Times in Washington, a very minor editor, I might say. And but one of my jobs was to work with young people. The New York Times of Washington would bring in young people who maybe were just out of college, or in a few cases maybe still in college, as really sort of glorified. There was a concept, the clerks, they called them. They were gophers, basically. Did run around the newsroom, doing various jobs, sharpening pencils, getting coffee, that sort of thing. I loved this. I thought working with these young people was the most fun I'd ever had in years. And So it occurred to me that if I became the editor of the Greensboro Daily News and Record, I could work with young people as a regular thing because it was a much younger staff. This was a smaller paper, not all these big, high-powered, famous journalists that were on the New York Times. And I found that to be true, and I loved every minute of that. I enjoyed that. So I spent probably 4 years as editor in Greensboro, working with primarily a younger staff. I enjoyed that. The owner of the larger company, again, another one of the endless line of people who saved my bacon over the years, of my mentor, another mentor, decided I might be a publisher, but he realized I couldn't balance my own checkbook, so he sent me to a program at the Harvard Business School for 5 months, to try to hammer some basic financial skills into my head. Not sure they succeeded, but anyway, he had in mind that I would then become publisher of the Roanoke newspaper, which I did in '82, and we can sum this up quickly because the most interesting thing about that job, which I then did till I retired at the end of 2000, so that's 18 years. The interesting thing about that job, I took it thinking that I knew everything there was to know about newspapers. And I discovered that I didn't know a thing about newspapers. that I thought I was so smart, and once again discovered that I wasn't nearly as smart as I thought. By which I mean, I had always been focused on the news part of newspapers, the reporting, the editing, the headline writing, the getting the thing done each and every day. And when I became publisher in Roanoke, it was a whole world I never even imagined. The circulation department, the production department, the advertising department, the need to pay attention to what newsprint costs were. Just all sorts of interesting things. How the press worked. It was endlessly fascinating because, as I say, I had always loved the newspaper from my very earliest memories, but I really didn't know anything about how they worked outside the news side of the newspaper.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting and fitting end to my working life.
Did you enjoy learning about
I loved it. I loved it. I've always been interested in new and different things that I know nothing about, and the realization of how complicated. Of course, it's totally different now, and this has all changed. But then, the realization of how complicated it was to get that thing done every day, 7 days a week, was just amazing to me.
Because you look at the paper and how much material is inside of it, and sometimes it's hard to believe that comes out every day.
Totally hard to believe. Now, it's the shadow of its former self now, but
Yeah.
then we were, when I went to Roanoke, we were publishing 135,000 copies a day. We sent a truck every morning all the way to Bristol. We home delivered that paper all over 19 counties in Southwest Virginia. We put that thing together every night, printed it in Roanoke, bundled up the paper, put it on all those trucks. I mean, I think we had like 40 delivery trucks. They took that thing all over and then came back and did it all again the next day.
What time would the printing press have to finish printing the papers for them to go out on time?
Depending on what day of the week it was. Sunday, obviously, a much bigger paper, started much earlier. In fact, part of that paper was printed early, but Basically, we tried to keep it open late enough. We didn't always succeed to get sports scores in from the night before. Now, when West Coast baseball was always a problem because, of course, that was the time zones made that impossible. But so roughly 11 o'clock at night
Wow.
was about as late press would start. Probably a couple hours later, and then they would print for depending again on what day of the week it was, but we committed to getting all the papers delivered by 6 a.m. On weekdays and 7 a.m. on Sundays. We didn't always succeed at that, but that was our goal.
Yeah. What happens if a headline breaking news event happens while you're in the middle of printing a newspaper? Do you just have to wait till the next paper comes out? Or?
Fortunately, it happened very rarely.
Yeah.
It happens a lot in the movies, but unfortunately, it didn't happen very much to us. I mean, you think about it. I mean, not much happens at 2 o'clock in the morning. I mean, so sometimes, of course, there are exceptions. I can't remember a case. I'd have to think about that. There probably were 2 or 3 cases where some dramatic thing would happen. Somebody would die. That would be the main thing.
Would overseas stories come into?
Pardon?
Would overseas stories have an effect on that too?
That's true. But I can't remember a lot of that. And it was very complicated to stop the. The old line was "Stop the presses." That's what the crusty old editor yelled into the phone. Happened very rarely, very rarely. It was awfully complicated to have that happen. And you didn't have the staff there for one thing. The paper was not as computer generated as it is now. So it was very physical. You had to do a lot of physical things to remake the paper. It just didn't happen very often.
Yeah. I read, and I believe Luke did as well, that you were a part of the Virginia Humanities Board.
I was.
Can you tell us a bit about that and what you were involved with when on that board?
A dear friend of mine in Roanoke had been involved in it. She decided that because she was involved in it, I ought to be involved in it. I knew nothing about it. It was very interesting. The humanities, of course, history, archaeology, culture of all kinds. They did a lot of very interesting things. I've been gone from the board. They've changed a lot, I think, under the people who came along later. But it tried to find things in Virginia that were common to us all. Folk music. They did an awful lot down this way with country music, bluegrass, all sorts of folk issues. They popularized or tried to popularize country music and that sort of thing, and just nothing was beyond them. It was a journalist's delight in a way.
Did you do that after you retired?
Yeah.
So you finally decided to retire in 2000. What was it like from working extremely hard all those years to retiring? Was that a big transition?
Well, I've been reflecting on this because I didn't get much. I had been a trustee of Hollins University, and was still a trustee of Hollins University, and I'd been retired for, let's see, probably, I don't know, a year or so, when the president of Hollins left rather suddenly, as college presidents often do, I guess. And one of my colleagues on the board of trustees called up and said, "Oh, this is just what you need to do." They needed a year or so to find a real college president. So they talked me eventually into becoming the interim president while they got a real president. And I thought, oh, this is going to be great. I mean, we're going to sit around and listen to Mozart all summer, and this is going to be so much fun. Gosh, it was some of the hardest work I ever did. A lot of different constituencies involved in a university. You got the faculty, the alumni, the staff, the students, all with somewhat different interests. A lot of complicated funding issues and that sort of thing going on. It was also some of the most interesting work I ever did too. So anyway, I did that for a little over a year. 9/11 happened while I was there, so that would have been the fall of 2001, and I left there at the end of 2002. Then somebody decided it would be a good thing if I went down to Virginia Tech and helped with a sort of a kind of a regional economic development think tank sort of thing down there. So I did that for 3 years. So I didn't really get retired until probably 2000, let's see, that'd be 2006 or so. And then I kind of became a full-time gardener, which I have loved every minute of, and that became a full-time job. So I'm still trying to get myself retired.
And you mentioned 9/11. How did it feel to look at these world events from the general public standpoint, not being involved in it or reporting with it? Was that interesting?
Very. I mean, my main, of course, as we all do, I remember it vividly. When it happened, and one of my journalistic memories of that was, by now, cable is really in the picture. CNN, CNBC, they're all really out there doing it. And it was extremely interesting to watch CNN coverage. They blanketed it. They had a camera everywhere. It was amazing. Everywhere in the world you could think of, they seemed to have a camera and a guy with a microphone. Mm-hmm. The problem was they didn't know anything. I mean, they'd never heard of Osama bin Laden. They didn't know anything about anything. If you switched to CBS, there was old Dan Rather and Dan Rather's colleagues, and they did not have a camera everywhere, but they knew a lot. They did know who Osama bin Laden was, and what all those issues involved in Al Qaeda and so forth, and just the contrast between the old school CBS people who had been around for a long time, had traveled widely, read widely, and knew all these people and knew what the issues were, versus the upstart CNN, which didn't have that experience and didn't have that same depth of knowledge, but just had that incredible presence everywhere. It was very interesting.
Yeah. And you mentioned that incredible presence. And today, news is extremely widely available. It's disseminated at a great amount.
I'll say.
And from many different sources.
Yeah.
Do you think it's harder for us to discern credible information than it was?
Oh, terrible. It's terrible. I just don't know. It's very hard to do. And the other thing that I think compounds the difficulty, when I was in school, now I'm going to sound like an old coot. I hate doing this, but I have to. When I was going through school, there were regular civics lessons where they tried to teach us about the media.
Yeah.
This is a news story, this is a headline, this is an editorial, this is a this is a that. Here's how you evaluate it. This thing comes out every day, folks. They're giving you their best shot, but hey, it may not be the last word on what really happened. Take it with a grain of salt. Use a little judgment. You can't necessarily believe everything. It's not that they're lying to you. It's just they don't know.
Yeah.
So we grew up with more experience and more background about how to use the media. And so nowadays, I think the problem is made more difficult, not only because there's so much more of it, but I think younger people don't get the kind of skills training, if you will, on how to use it. I don't have an answer for this.
How do you personally view media? How do you discern from what's factual? Being in the industry so long, do you have any advice on how to do that?
I really do take it all with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
And again, it's not that I think they're liars or that they're trying to mislead people, but I think what in my day used to be a fairly simple problem of, hey, we're doing the best we can, we have to put it out every day, we can't know everything, things may change, this is how it looks to us right now, but how it's going to look tomorrow, we don't know. Well, you multiply that now, instead of being one newspaper and 3 TV networks, you've got hundreds of different kinds of outlets, and they're all doing that. It just has put, it just has vastly complicated the problem.
Do you see a discernible difference between physical news, like the newspaper, and online news?
Not as much as I did, no.
What differences did you used to see?
When people used to get mad at me, which was often, they would shake their finger under my nose and they would say, what this town needs is another newspaper. If you had a little competition, you'd clean up your act. Didn't quite turn out that way. Now there's an infinite amount of competition, and it hadn't cleaned up anybody's act, in my opinion. It's made things worse, more difficult for everybody.
And you see news stories in modern times too, such as in Kentucky, when a newspaper was raided by the local police department. Do you think the threat to the freedom of the press is greater now than it was in modern times?
Gosh, that's a hard. I think it's always been there because I think journalists make people uncomfortable. Always have. I just think it's part of the nature of the beast. But I do think these are much more challenging and difficult times because I do think media plays such a huge role in, and it's hard to articulate exactly what I mean, but it's the stakes are much higher, I think, than they used to be, and I think people are looking more critically at all the institutions in our country, and the media just doesn't come out very well. I mean, people just don't trust us. I shouldn't say us, because I'm not involved in it anymore, but I mean, I think trust in media is down in the dumps, but so is trust in so many other things as well. Very difficult. I don't know what the answer is or what the outcome's going to be. Yeah. It's certainly not going to be easy to deal with.
And we talked about the progression in technology when it comes to media earlier. Back in the day, media juggernauts such as the New York Times was probably much more prominent. And I know they have a very large online footprint today.
Yeah, they do.
But actual physical media, such as newspapers, have been on the downtrend this past few years. What do you see about this? What do you think about the survivability of print media when it comes to the future?
Not going to happen. I mean, I think they're all, my old newspaper, the Roanoke Times, I saw the other day, I think they're printing 11,000 copies of that paper now. Which, of course, is just, it's not even printed in Roanoke, it's printed in Lynchburg. There's so few copies printed, they print that thing in Lynchburg and truck it to Roanoke. And, so many people, particularly people my age, are always regretting the passage of ink on paper. And I'm like everybody else. I loved it, and I still enjoy reading ink on paper. But the fact is that the computer, being able to get that stuff online, golly, it's not only cheaper. They don't have to buy all that paper and ink. They don't have to truck it all over everywhere. It's actually, in a way, easier to read. I read the New York Times online. And that paper is much easier to read online than it used to be when you had to paw through all those pages. The publisher of the New York Times, a very funny story. This goes back. This would have gone back to, I guess, my day. Publisher of the New York Times said that he thought it was that one time he should take the Sunday New York Times and read every word in it. So he did. He got the Sunday paper and he started to read, and he spent every minute reading the Sunday New York Times, that one edition, until finally on the following Thursday he gave up and said it couldn't be done. That's ridiculous. The online stuff is much easier, cheaper, more convenient. The ink on paper, I'm sure there'll always be some legacy kind of stuff, but it's history. It's going away. Doesn't make any sense anymore.
Do you think small town newspapers will be at the forefront of that disappearance?
No, I think they'll probably be among the last, I would assume.
That's interesting, because we have a local newspaper, the Carroll News, and it's recently started publishing an online edition where you can subscribe annually or whatever.
Too.
The Gazette too, yeah, that's right.
The Gazette, it's done the same thing. And they've really focused on, this past few months, updating their website.
Yes.
Modernizing it.
Completely redone it.
I think they see the handwriting on the wall.
Yeah.
That is that your generation, no way you're going to, and so people that don't do that are going to get lost in the shovel.
Yeah. Thanks. What advice do you have to the younger generations, particularly students like Luke and I, who want to pursue journalism or writing as a career field?
Oh, advice is very simple. Do it. You'll never regret it.
Do it.
There, like any job or any career, there were things that weren't always so much fun, but they were few and far between. It is absolutely astonishing that people will pay you to do this. It's so much fun. You get a free ticket to all events. You get a front row seat on all the big things that happen in the world. You get to ask uppity questions of people who think they're big shots. You'll have a wonderful time.
Do you think that formal education like you went through at university is the correct way to do that, or do you think that there are other viable avenues?
Well, there might be other viable avenues, but the benefit of the university is that it forces you to do things that you tell yourself you'll do, but you probably won't. For professor says read these 100 pages, and you do it because you know you're going to get a question about it the next day. And if you try to do that on your own, well, maybe if you were super duper disciplined, but most of us aren't. And the other advantage of the university, I think, education, is that it opens you up to things that you really didn't even know about.
Right. That's true.
That you wouldn't study on your own because you didn't know about them.
Would you encourage aspiring journalists to pursue a journalism degree?
I would not.
Some more.
I would definitely not.
Maybe.
I mean, as I said at the beginning, I was very lucky that where I went to school knew what it was doing and did not give me a lot of journalism, because you learn the journalism by doing it.
Right.
No, you need some. I mean, I'm not dissing it completely. I got a great education, and it definitely gave me a leg up in what I was doing. So, sure, I would. I mean, courses in how to be a reporter, courses in basic journalism law, that sort of thing, are perfectly worthwhile. But what you really need is exposure to the liberal arts. Yes. I mean, history and politics. You need some sense of context, and how does what Joe Biden is doing, how does it, fit in with the historical pattern? And the more of that you can get, the better. Not just history, I don't mean, but everything. I mean, look at science now. I mean, gosh, I had very little science, unfortunately, but nowadays, if you have the least little aptitude for any kind of science, get into, a science program.
Yeah. It seems like today, especially among the younger population, there is a sentiment or an attitude of lack of interest in current events. Can you talk about the importance of being cognizant about what's going on in the world around us, especially to our younger listeners?
Gosh, well, I can certainly empathize with and understand why you might want to tune all that out. Very easy to understand how that could happen. But listen, this world is going to be what you all make of it. And I really sincerely think that it's a cliche almost, but people say we get the government we deserve. I think that's absolutely true, and waiting for other people to do the right thing is not a good bet. It's not easy. It's not pleasant. It's messy. It's this. It's that, and And I guess we all one solace would be that we can't all do everything all the time. So sure, when you're young and you're learning about all sorts of life things, okay, you're not necessarily studying the Federal Reserve Board and its interest rate policies. I get that, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But as you go along in life, I mean, you acquire more responsibilities, and for a country to be successful means that people have got to take responsibility for what happens.
Yeah, and you spoke about your love for history or your interest in history. Has there been a figure in American history that's really reached out to you personally?
That's really very, very, one of the things I think is lots of historical figures have. I mean, who wouldn't be in awe of Abraham Lincoln? I mean, gosh, I find myself reading a Lincoln book, and I think, how can I be spending my time reading yet another book about Abraham Lincoln? But I mean, he was just such a. But I was a huge fan of Thomas Jefferson, and he was such a Renaissance figure. I mean, he just, as you know, he was into everything. He was not only a politician and a thinker, but he was an architect. He was this. He was that. He was a farmer. He was a gardener. Everything that guy did, he touched. He excelled at. And I thought I had dealt with the fact that he was a slave owner. That's what rich people did in those days, in the South at least, and not just in the South, but a lot of places. I'm a little less enamored of Jefferson than I used to be. Some recent research has I think made his involvement with the slavery situation a little less tolerable than I might have thought it was. I think in his last days, Jefferson, the research shows, he wasn't just a passive owner of slaves because he was in the South and everybody did it and he had to do it. He actually became kind of a breeder and exporter of slaves. I mean, the record suggests that he made his way in the world after he was president by really basically breeding and selling slaves down the river, as they used to call it, to Alabama and Mississippi, and that's very troublesome. But I find that an interesting thing that your perception of people changes over time. I mean, I think that's healthy.
Yeah, that's true.
Have you read any David McCullough?
Oh yeah.
I love his John Adams. That's one of my favorite books. Would you recommend any books about the Founding Fathers to us?
His David McCullough, to a couple of anecdotes. He came to Hollins while I was president, and I think I'm right. Anyway, his greatest book, in my opinion, is biography of Harry Truman. If you haven't read the Truman biography, you need to do it. It's a great.
I have it. I haven't read it yet.
It's a great book. The other anecdote is that, and maybe this affected my own thinking, McCullough said he started out on that project to write a biography of Adams and Jefferson, who were, of course, contemporaries and famously died on the very same day, the 4th of July, the 50th 4th of July, 1826. And McCullough said that the more he researched for that biography of the two of them, the less he liked Thomas Jefferson. And finally, he decided that he couldn't write a biography of the two of them, that it was just going to be Adams, which I found fascinating.
And Adams, he was a deeply human individual.
Yeah.
If you see his letters with his wife, Abigail,
yeah,
they're really touching.
Oh,
They're
very much so.
personal. And you see his life, it wasn't just what he did in office. He had a lot of really touching personal relationships and stuff going on at home that affected him almost as much as what was going on in Philadelphia or down in Washington. But yeah, did you meet Mr. McCullough?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I try to get most of his books. I have most of his books, and I've read a good amount of them. But I love the way he writes.
He just fabulous. He everything he does is good, and as I say, the Truman biography is just a remarkable piece of work.
Have you read Americans in Paris?
I've got it. I have not read it.
I really enjoyed it. He's an American romantic almost. He realizes the faults with the nation, but in his writings you get to see the base spirit of America in his writings, and I think he really translates that, I think, better than anyone.
Yep.
But as we're wrapping up here, we always have a series of questions we ask our interviewees. What advice would you give to a young person, a young adult, somebody in their early 20s? They don't really know what they want to do yet. They're just trying to make their way in the world.
Well, as I was saying earlier, I think don't be discouraged that you don't know what you're doing. Things these days especially are changing so fast. I would just say be alert. Keep your eyes open. Take an interest in things. Be curious. I came to think that curiosity may be one of the greatest qualities that humans can have. Take an interest in other things, and you'll find something that grabs you. Don't necessarily rush it. Take your time. Wait and see what happens. But I think be alert. That's the main advice I would have, and be curious. Try to take an interest in what's going on and what makes things tick, and that's how you discover what you find really interesting is what you want to do the rest of your life.
Yeah. And this final question, it's a bit of a doozy, but we've asked everybody this question, and we normally get really good responses.
They're always very thoughtful and meaningful, and they always reflect the character of a person. And the question is, what is the meaning of life to you?
Personally.
The meaning of life. Gosh. I guess you want to look back at the end of it, feeling that you've made some sort of contribution, and that you've worked to try to have some sort of understanding of your very minor place in it all, what the bigger, whether it's God or a moving power or whatever your personal belief system might be, but you've thought about that and care about it wherever you come out, whether you come out a fundamentalist Christian or you come out a non-believer, you've given it a lot of thought and tried to fit yourself into that larger picture, and that gives you, I think, a sense of accountability, that we are all accountable for what we do and don't do. And that's what you want to be able at the end of your life, it seems to me, to look back on and be able to say, boy, I sure did screw up my full share of the time, but it wasn't for lack of trying, I guess, is a kind of a trite way to put that. It wasn't that I didn't care, that I was indifferent. Don't be indifferent.
Well, Mr. Rugaber, it's been an honor to speak with you this
Oh, well, I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.